Hi, I'm Beth, creator of the Facebook page, Canning and Dehydrating Recipes and How-Tos. I'm not a professional, I'm a homemaker, but I like canning, I like dehydrating, and I definitely have learned a lot this past year on freeze drying. Recently, I posted a video on the dirty little secrets of freeze drying, that being that freeze drying is fairly easy. It's the rehydrating or the reconstituting that's a bit of a challenge. I also indicated that part of our goal in having a freeze dryer was not only preserving and saving leftovers, which has been a blessing in so many ways, but also to put together at least a couple of weeks of actual meals that we can take on the go, meals that we can use in an emergency or whatever. And today I'm starting my day one of those recipes. Now what I did is I put together a menu of recipes for a whole day. My goal was that if we were traveling, I could grab some bags and we'd have a breakfast, a lunch, a dinner, maybe a dessert. And in case of an emergency, I have that too. So over the next few months, and it may take as long as a year, I'm going to put together a day's worth of menus with all three of those meals included. Now you might ask, why does it take so long to do that? Well, the reality is we are empty nesters at this point. There's only two of us, and it takes a lot of food to fill the 4 trays in my freeze dryer. That said, doing things like leftovers, like we had leftover pizza and I was able to cut it into squares and save it, or a leftover onion or leftover fruit. It really is a good way to use your leftovers and not waste them, especially with the price of food. But anyway, let's move forward on what I'm doing over the next couple of days, and this will be one compacted video. So I have 14 days of menus that include a breakfast, lunch, and a dinner. And today I'm working on one of those days. And for breakfast, I have planned freeze-dried oatmeal with freeze-dried blueberries. For lunch, vegetable soup, freeze-dried. For a snack, some yogurt bites, something that's a little bit healthy. For dessert, some freeze-dried cheesecake. And for dinner, which I guess I skipped over, was freeze-dried lasagna. So today I'm actually working on the oatmeal and I'm working on the lasagna to get those into the freeze dryer. So the oatmeal, I like steel cut oatmeal, and let me show you what I did. Here are the trays of freeze-dried oatmeal. One tray I did all together and another tray I sectioned out, but it is completely dry. I did this with milk. You can see it just falls apart. Steel cut oatmeal. So let's get this packaged. All right, so I mentioned I like steel cut oatmeal, and I don't like the kind of steel cut oatmeal that cooks in 3 minutes. Regular oatmeal or packaged oatmeal is fine, and if that's your choice, that's what you should absolutely use. I just prefer the texture and the nutrition of a steel cut oatmeal. So when I get my steel cut oatmeal, and again, I don't use the quick kind, I put it in a jar just to keep it fresh, and you'll see that it's pretty granular. And if you're a fan of steel cut oatmeal, you know that it takes about 20 minutes to cook in the morning. Not a big deal, but sometimes you just want something quicker. So the other thing is with the steel cut oatmeal, it says that 1/4 cup of the steel cut oatmeal is 1 serving. For me, that's not quite enough. I like 1/3 of a cup. So what I did is I took a pan and I wanted to make multiple portions of this since I wanted to freeze dry it. So I wanted to make 9 portions so that I would have some in our pantry that I can grab quickly, but also put some in our long-term storage. So I took 3 cups of steel cut oatmeal. To that, I added 11 cups of liquid. Now, I like my steel cut oatmeal with milk, and because I'm thinking also about wanting to store this long term, I actually added 2 cups of milk. You can use any kind of milk you want, oat milk, whole milk, 2% skim, whatever you want to use. But I used 2 cups of milk, and then I used 9 cups of water. Then what I did is I cooked that oatmeal down until it got done, and I can taste it by the texture. And then I cooked it just a little bit more to get a little bit more of that water off, because when you're freeze drying it, you're going to remove all the liquid. So why not do some of that on the stove? I then put that in my pan, my freeze dryer pans, and I put that in the freezer put it in the freezer to freeze. You can freeze it directly in your freeze dryer, but of course that takes more electricity, and my deep freeze is running anyway, so why not put the trays in there? I've been putting the trays in the freeze dryer with other food to freeze dry as I fill that up. So I have, this is the uncooked oatmeal. I have, I think 2 trays at this point of steel cut oatmeal that has been freeze dried. And again, mine is with milk. So what I do is I take my freeze dried oatmeal and then I take a rolling pin and smash that down so I can easily measure it. So when I take it out, I actually have segments like this. And let's see if I can open these up here. So I have segments just because they're easier to break. Now I could pack these and use these and that's not a problem, but I want to be more compressed and save room. Plus, if I'm packaging this with sharp objects, my bags are more likely to break. But you can see that this is just more like a cracker. You could eat it this way if you wanted to. I did not put sugar or anything in mine. You certainly could do that if you wanted to, but sugar is something that absorbs moisture, so I will just sweeten my oatmeal if I choose to when I prepare it. But the reality is I'm going to be packaging mine with blueberries, so that's sort of a natural sweetener. So what I do is I just take my freeze-dried oatmeal, and again, mine is with milk. You can do it plain or you can do it without milk. I put it into a Ziploc bag, like so. Sometimes you have to kind of shake this out of here. And then just close up the bag, but leave just a little bit of the air out there so that you can, you know, get the air out when you're smashing this. And then I just take a rolling pin and break this up, like so. Roll it out. And then you really have an easier way to measure this. So then I'll put it into my jar. And again, I'll just shake this bag down. I'll reuse this bag. And I will dump that carefully. Get that shaken down. Get the oatmeal into my jar. And I need to grab my funnel to do this. Bear with me for just a second. All right, so I just used my canning funnel and I put that in a jar. I have the bag mostly sealed but open on the edge. And then I am just going to dump that oatmeal right into my canning jar. Now, I can store and will store a lot of this oatmeal because I'm going to use this over the next year. So I consider that short-term storage. And I will store that right in a jar. I'll use a mason jar. I'll reuse my canning lids for something like that. And this is really freeze-dried oatmeal with milk in it. Now, when I get the last tray of my oatmeal freeze-dried, frozen, I don't know what you want to call it sometimes, I'll put that in there, and then I'll be packaging this with my blueberries, and I'll have my breakfast done. So I'll show you that when I get that done. That probably is going to be a couple of days from now because I do have 1 tray of oatmeal to get done. But that's where I'm at with getting the oatmeal done for my day of food. The other thing I'm going to do today is I'm going to work on lasagna. And I have decided I'm going to do a deconstructed lasagna simply because I think if you have the layers of the noodles, I think it's going to be harder to reconstitute or rehydrate. So stay tuned and I'll show you how I prepared that. I'm now going to work on the dinner portion of my first day's menu for freeze drying. And I'm making lasagna. I'm going to do a deconstructed lasagna because I think it'll be easier to rehydrate. So first thing I want to do is get some cottage cheese, and I don't have any in the refrigerator, but I do have some dehydrated cottage cheese. So the curds and everything are there. And when I did this, I marked the jar so I knew that this was a 12-ounce container of cottage cheese. So I'm simply going to rehydrate this and get started with making my lasagna. So when you have something like cottage cheese or anything that you're going to use short-term, I define short-term as a year, you definitely can put it in a jar, but vacuum seal it, which is what I have done here. So I'm going to open up my jar, and I always put a paper towel on anything that's a little bit powdery. It keeps it from getting into the vacuum sealer. And I'm simply going to pour that into a glass dish. So what I have, and I'm using a glass dish just so that you can see it, is you can see that the cottage cheese, some of it is in a little bit of chunks, but I also have more fine chunks in there, but you can see the cottage cheese texture. Could have I powdered this and made it smooth like a powder? Absolutely, but I kind of like the cottage cheese texture. So to rehydrate this, most often you're going to think about how you would normally use something, and while the cottage cheese is going to be baked in the lasagna, cottage cheese is something that's typically cold, so I'm going to use cold water. So ice water would have been better. I just don't have any right now, so I'm just using cold water, and I'm just going to pour this in a little bit and then give it a stir, and then let the cheese absorb the water, and that's going to take a little bit of time. And you want to add water slowly, in that you don't want to add too much, right? So add some, stir it, add some more. It's not going to rehydrate instantly. It's going to take a little bit of time to do that. So I think that this glass is probably a 12-ounce glass. I'll have to see. But you can see at the bottom now that I'm getting, I don't know if you can see this, you can see that there's getting to be liquid on the bottom. And cottage cheese, if you keep in mind, it's soft and it does have a very loose texture. So I'm just going to keep stirring this, because what that's going to do is get the moisture on all the different pieces of cottage cheese. And it's going to take a little bit of time, like I said, to rehydrate that. So I'm going to add a little bit more. And I'm going to again stir it. And there is no magic formula in terms of how much water to use. You just sort of add it until you get the texture that you expect to get, and then you know that it's going to rehydrate from there. In other words, the cottage cheese, which feels a lot like styrofoam, is going to absorb some of that water. So I think I'm going to end up adding the rest of this. It's starting to look pretty good, actually. But again, it's going to be crunchy until it rehydrates that water. So I am going to add a little bit more. I think I'm probably going to end up using this whole glass. Yeah, this is good right here, I think. So this is starting to look very much like cottage cheese. I think you can see what that looks like. So what I'm going to do now is I'm simply going to put this in the refrigerator and let it rehydrate. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and start browning my hamburger that I'm going to use for the lasagna. I'm ready to assemble my deconstructed lasagna to freeze dry, and then of course later to reconstitute. Before I get started, I want to show you the cottage cheese. I did end up adding more water to it. I ended up really adding almost twice as much water as there was dry mixture, but it definitely is cottage cheese and it tastes like it and it's rehydrated. This is actually a little bit drier than I would normally do it if I wanted to eat cottage cheese plain, but because I'm going to freeze dry it, it's going to remove the moisture. I didn't want to add more moisture, but it tastes just like cottage cheese and it rehydrated beautifully. So if you can find cottage cheese or sour cream or any of that on sale and you have a freeze dryer, put it in there because it works really well. My lasagna is a pretty simple thing. I use noodles, I use hamburger, I use a jar of spaghetti sauce and cottage cheese, and then some mozzarella cheese. Now, a couple of things are different than how I normally do this. I know that when I make it in a pan, I usually use 9 lasagna noodles. What I am doing for the freeze drying is I broke up my lasagna noodles basically into about bite-sized pieces, but I still have 9 of them. And I just broke them up. And I did this primarily because when you're reconstituting or rehydrating your food, the smaller the pieces, the quicker it's going to rehydrate. So normally I would do the layers of the lasagna, but I think it's going to be easier to put it into an edible form if everything's mixed together. So that's the first thing that I would recommend. And secondly, oftentimes I'll use like a wheat lasagna. When you're storing food long-term, the plain lasagna will store long-term better. By long-term, I mean more than 3 years. I plan really on rotating my food, but definitely might have this in storage for a year or two and have chosen to use the plain noodles for that. Next, you can use hamburger or you can use sausage. But another thing with storing your food is fats can go rancid. So I treated this meat a little bit differently than normal. I browned it, and you don't want to over brown it. You want to brown it basically until there's no pink in it, but you don't want to overcook it because you don't want to remove all of that moisture, even though I know I'm going to be doing that for freeze drying. But this is an 80-20 hamburger. You can use whatever hamburger you want. But again, you need to keep in mind that grease can go rancid over a long term. The way I'm treating this, I comfortably can store this food for 3 to 5 years, even with the meat. So what I did is I browned my hamburger just to the point that it was done. And then I drained all the grease off of it and let that sit for about 10 or 15 minutes till a lot of that grease was removed. Then I took and I rinsed this in hot water. Stirred it up, rinsed it, probably ran the faucet for 60 seconds or less, but with hot water, and that was to remove the extra grease. Then I put it on a paper towel to absorb the moisture and any other grease that might be there. But at the end of the day, there's still going to be grease in there. Does that remove some of your flavor from the food? Technically, yes, you're removing the fat. Fat has flavor. But again, I think I can make that up with what else I'm doing. So whether you choose to use sausage or whether you choose to use hamburger, you do want to remove your grease if you're going to store it long term. And by long term, I'm thinking maybe more than in 6 months even with the fat. I use a jar of spaghetti sauce because it's quick and easy. If you want to use homemade tomato sauce, you can do that. You can use whatever you want. I have a jar that is... well, everything's changing. This is 24 ounces, I guess, of spaghetti sauce. And then I have 12 ounces of cottage cheese. Again, mine was freeze-dried. I rehydrated it, but 12 ounces of cottage cheese is what I typically use for that. My mozzarella cheese, I usually don't put that in my lasagna until it's almost baked, and so I'm going to follow that same rule. So I'm going to use deconstructed lasagna, again, because I think it's going to be easiest to reconstitute on the back end. So I'm going to put this together in kind of an odd fashion. I'm going to start with the spaghetti sauce simply because that is the loosest. It has liquid in it. It's going to be easier to mix everything together if I have that done. Now, one thing I always do is I put a little cold water in there just to get the rest of that sauce out of there. And I still want to do that because I don't want to waste any of that. So I just give it a quick shake and put that in there and get that out. There's probably a little bit more that could be gathered if I was so inclined. Then I'm going to add my cottage cheese, my reconstituted cottage cheese that I had in the freeze dryer. Great thing to have. And get that all in there. And I am going to add a little bit of water to this also, just so that I can get all of that out that I possibly can. Not a lot, but a little bit. And I'm just going to take my spatula here. But food's so expensive, you want to get everything out of it that you can, right? So we'll put that in there. And then I'm just going to give this a quick stir. So I'm mixing the spaghetti sauce and the cottage cheese just to get all of that brought together. What I also did is I weighed my pan while I was preparing the ingredients. And the reason I did that is if you know how much your food weighs raw, or before it's freeze-dried, it gives you some idea how much water to add on the back end. It's not a foolproof method, but it gives you some idea. So I wanted to weigh this prior to adding all my ingredients to it. I weigh it in grams instead of ounces, and the reason I do that is because there are 28 grams in 1 ounce of water. So that can make a difference. It doesn't seem like 1 ounce could make a difference, but at the end I don't want a soupy lasagna, but I want it loose enough that it's going to taste good. So I have my cottage cheese and my spaghetti sauce mixed up. I am going to add just a sprinkle of oregano. If you have Italian seasoning, you could do that. I don't normally do that, but because of the fact that I took that the grease out of the hamburger, I'm going to add that just for a little bit of extra flavor. Don't want to use too much because your flavors are going to become pretty concentrated. I'm going to add my hamburger, which again has been rinsed and drained, and the grease removed as much as possible. And I'm going to give that a stir. Put that in there, like so. And then I'm just going to take my noodles that I broke apart basically into bite size. Again, I did that because I want to have bite-sized pieces so that it's easier to reconstitute. My mother-in-law was a school cook. She taught me years ago, you don't have to pre-cook your lasagna noodles when you're making lasagna. And I haven't done that for over 40 years, and it works great. Typically, I'll put, if I'm making regular lasagna, I'll put a layer of sauce on the bottom. I'll put down my noodles, my cottage cheese, my meat, some more sauce, the noodles, and just layer it however many layers you want. I cook it for about 45 minutes covered. And then the last 15 minutes, I'll take and put the cheese on it and cook it uncovered. It works great. You don't have to pre-cook your noodles, and I'm not pre-cooking them here for the same reason. So again, these are just my dried noodles, broken up into pieces, and I'm going to stir those up so that they basically get coated and mixed in with all of the other ingredients I have. Now this looks pretty soupy at this point in time, but keep in mind that these noodles have not been cooked and they're going to absorb a lot of this. So I just want to push that all in there to get that mixed up as well as I can. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bowl here, and I'm just going to add all of that back in here, like so. Noodles and all. So we're just going to put it in here. And it's not real appetizing looking this way, I will admit that. But again, I think we're going for the taste, and we're going for the practicality of a quick meal or an emergency meal, or something for camping or hiking that's going to be really easy. So I'm just going to take this. I have an ungreased bowl. I'm going to spread that out. And just like that, I have my deconstructed lasagna. So I'm going to put this in the oven. I'm going to cover it. I'm going to cook it for about 45 minutes like I normally do. Typically, I will take a paring knife and just sort of stab it to make sure the noodles are done. You'll be able to kind of feel that. Then I'll put some cheese on the top, let that brown a little bit. And when all of that is done, then I will come back and I will show you how I get that in the freeze dryer and move forward with it. So stay tuned. Be sure to subscribe to the channel in the lower right corner so that you can follow along with this series. Sure would appreciate a thumbs up. It helps me get this video out to others and lets me know that you're interested in it. So stay tuned. My deconstructed lasagna is ready to put into my freeze dryer pans. I baked this for 45 minutes covered, and then I took the cover off and baked it another 15 minutes uncovered. Now when I took it out, it seemed a little bit soupy, which is not unusual for lasagna. I let it sit for about 10 minutes, and the pans are still too hot for me to handle here. But it looks pretty good now in terms of, staying together. So I have my deconstructed lasagna. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to prepare this for freeze drying. I'm hoping all of this is going to fit on one tray. Yeah, it's not gonna be a problem, it looks like. So what you do when you have a freeze dryer is obviously you can freeze your food in the freeze dryer. We have a chest freezer, and I like to put my trays in there when I have room because the chest freezer is already running. So if I have room, why not let the chest freezer, which is already running, freeze the food rather than have the freeze dryer do it? So I have a pretty much entry-level freeze dryer. My trays are 8 inches by 20 inches, and I have a 4-tray freeze dryer. I have the Stay Fresh brand. I'm really, really happy with it. I chose it for a number of reasons, not the least of which is customer service, but also it had, it had a candy mode, which at the time Harvest Right didn't have. And the reliability, honestly, has been much better than the complaints that you see online with the other brand. That's not to say that other people don't have the other brand and don't love it, but this has been really, really a good experience for me. This is going to be probably batch 91 or 92 in terms of what I'm freeze drying. So generally when you put your food in here, you don't want to fill it much beyond the end of the tray. I have a second tray here because I didn't know if this was all going to fit. You can go a little bit past it. This actually fit perfectly. And what I'm going to do is get this prepped, and I'm going to let this cool a little bit before I put it in the freezer. Let's see, I have a rag here. This is a little bit spilled on the edge here, so I just want to get rid of that. So what's important when you freeze dry something, in my opinion, is to know what your servings are. I know that when we make this batch of lasagna, we basically are able to have a meal, plus my husband usually will have a healthy serving of lunch the next day. So when I bought the freeze dryer, I did invest in these dividers, which will divide things all the way up to 40 portions, depending upon what I'm doing. Because we typically will eat 2/3 to 3/4 of a lasagna for a dinner, and then my husband will have lunch the next day, I decided for portion control that I'm going to divide this into 4. Now, I don't use this for everything that I do, but I do use it for something like this, just because I know exactly where I'm at with it. So I can put this in. This basically cuts the lasagna, so to speak. Let's see here. Do I have this in the right way? Nope, I have it backwards. I knew that because it wasn't cutting in the way it usually does. So you just push this in and you end up with nice portions. Now these portions are going to be a little bit big for me to put in the Mylar bags, but I'll just break them in half afterwards. But this is easier than trying to break all the pieces because this will be fairly fragile when it gets done. This won't be exact, but it'll be close. The other thing that I forgot to do, but I will do differently here, is I forgot to weigh what this was cooked. Why do I want to do that? Because it gives me some sense of how much water that I'm going to use. So what I'll actually do is weigh this tray, because it's the same as this weight. I'll take this out for a minute, and then I'll weigh the food, and because I'll have tare weight, I'll know what my net weight is. And then I know when I cook it about how much water to add to it. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to weigh my trays, but I'm going to put this in the chest freezer. I'm going to let it freeze for 24 hours, and then I'm going to put it in the freeze dryer. This is going to take probably about a day and a half, maybe 2 days, depending upon the humidity the next couple days, to freeze dry. And when that's done, then I'm going to be back one more time, and I'm going to show you how to rehydrate the lasagna, but also the oatmeal and blueberries. So please stay tuned, because the dirty little secret with freeze drying is you can freeze dry anything, but how do you get it back to an edible state? So stay tuned. I'm back, and I have completely freeze dried my steel cut oatmeal and the lasagna, and now I want to show you how I rehydrate it. So I'm going to start with the oatmeal. I knew that when I did my oatmeal that I had 9 portions of oatmeal, and I tested it with some blueberries because that's my plan, is to have it with blueberries. Now I have a full half-gallon jar with that because, again, when you freeze dry it, it's not going to shrink down like it will when it's rehydrated. So I tested it with the blueberries, and it took about 10 minutes. And I want it a little bit faster, so I'll probably, when I pack it long term, will probably squeeze my blueberries to make a blueberry powder and then add that to the oatmeal. But I have some left here, some of the steel cut oatmeal, and you can see the grains are pretty fine in here. And remember, I did mine with milk, so it looks like I have powdered milk in here. But it reconstitutes or rehydrates pretty easily. So I have some hot water here, boiling water actually, and I'm just going to add a little bit. It seems like adding about 2/3 of a cup gets me to where I want it to get, or not 2/3 of a cup, 2/3 of the amount of oatmeal I have. And again, you can add the hot water based on the consistency you like your oatmeal. If you like it a little bit looser, you're going to add a little bit more. If you don't, you're going to add a little bit less. But pretty quickly, I have what looks like oatmeal. Now I'm going to put a cover over this for just a minute and let that sit and soften. And in the meantime, I'm going to show you how to, how I'm going to take my lasagna. So again, I took my lasagna and I broke, remember, the lasagna noodles into pieces. So I have the hard lasagna with the cheese, with the meat. Looks a little bit like pizza on the back. And I'm going to use, again, a glass container here just so you can see what's going on. And I'm going to break this up a little bit so it fits in here. Now, there's a couple of ways you could do this. You could do this in a pan and add water to about maybe 1/3 to a halfway through, cover it tightly with foil, and put it in the oven. My goal is to have food that I can just add hot water to in case of an emergency, or in case we're traveling in a hotel. We could use a coffee maker, for example, to rehydrate. So I have my pieces of freeze-dried lasagna. I'm using a measuring cup primarily because it's something that you can see. Here's an example of a freeze-dried noodle, and it's completely crunchy. You can totally eat it just like this if you choose to, but lasagna you want hot, right? So I'm just going to add some hot water, and immediately what happens is the lasagna and the noodles start shrinking down a little bit as I add the hot water. And I'm probably going to need somewhere between a half and a third. So what happens initially is you can see the water here. Hopefully you can see the water. You can see it's liquid. And I'm going to let that soak. Now those noodles are going to take up the water along with the meat and the cheese. And I'm going to let this sit for 5 minutes. And after 5 minutes, I'm going to check and see whether or not I want to add more hot water to that. So let's check the oatmeal in the meantime here. That's literally just been a couple of minutes. See if this is ready. It totally is. So this oatmeal probably took, what, 2 minutes, 3 minutes? This is a little bit stiff. I'm probably going to add just a touch more water just because I like it a little bit looser. But it rehydrates almost instantly, the steel cut oatmeal. Steel cut oatmeal is something I love for breakfast. You know it takes about 20 minutes to cook, but now I have oatmeal, great consistency. I can add a sweetener to this. I can add fruit powders. Again, I'm going to be packing mine with blueberries, but because the blueberries take a little longer to hydrate, I'm actually going to crush those blueberries and make a blueberry powder. It's going to make blue or purple oatmeal, and I'm okay with that because it's really quick. So I will be back in just a couple of minutes, and we'll see how the lasagna is doing. It's been 5 minutes, and I ate my oatmeal while I was waiting. Full confession, as I was eating the oatmeal, I decided it really could use a couple more minutes just to soften up a little bit more. It was totally edible, but I think I like it just a little bit softer. So I would add my hot water, get it to the consistency you want, and I'd let it sit the full 5 minutes. I did not add sugar when I made my oatmeal because when you put in an oxygen absorber, sugar will get rock hard, and that might change how I rehydrate this. You could make your oatmeal with some maple syrup for a sweetener if you want, and I think that would freeze dry fine. But this 5 minutes, and I have really almost instant oatmeal out of steel cut. Now let's see how the lasagna is doing. All right, so when I look at this, it definitely has taken up all of the water. It's a little bit thick. I want to get a bigger noodle out of here and try that and see what that looks like. All right, so this is what it's looking like right now. Let's pull a noodle out of here and see where we're at with it. So I have a noodle here. It's definitely limp. It's edible at this point, but I think that noodle is a little bit al dente, and I think that this is just a little bit soft, or a little bit more firm than I want to have it. And here actually is a noodle that seems actually harder. And as I look at that particular noodle, it really didn't soak up any moisture yet. Now, when it's thick like this, it's going to be harder for your noodles or anything else, your meat, to rehydrate because the thickness of everything makes it harder for it to soak up. So I am going to add just a little bit more water to this. And I'm going to give it another stir. And remember that you're going to start with less water and you can always add more. You want to have it maybe just a little bit thinner than what you want to have it when you end up with, because again, your food is going to soak up some of that moisture. So I've added a little bit more water. I'm going to let this sit for another 5 minutes, and then we're going to take one more look at it. It's been 5 more minutes, so let's see where we're at with this. Okay, the consistency looks really good in terms of what we would like. The noodles seem like they're done. Let me find a bigger noodle again and taste it and see. Now again, the bigger your noodles are, the longer it's going to take. I broke my noodles up pretty well. That's done. The noodles are done. This tastes like fresh lasagna. It doesn't have the layered look because I figured that would be harder to rehydrate. But this is really good. I actually have, well, you aren't going to be able to see it. I actually have some cheese that you can actually see how it's stringy, from the melted cheese in there, the cottage cheese. The meat is rehydrated great. So we have now completed the oatmeal and the lasagna for the day one meal that we're putting apart. So this is really part one. I still need to do the yogurt drops, the vegetable soup, and the cheesecake bites. I'm calling them cheesecake bites, which is going to be part 2 of this video. Meaning part 2, it'll be a separate video. And I would encourage you to watch that, because even if you don't want to put the whole meal together, you'll learn how to make different things. My goal again was to have 14 days of meals: breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, and dessert, as well as beverages. So this is part 1. If you like this video at all, if you learn something about freeze-drying lasagna or steel-cut oatmeal and rehydrating it, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. You can subscribe to my channel in the lower right column. This concludes part 1. Please stay tuned for part 2, which I hope to have up in the near future. Thanks for watching.